and go.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on what part of the world you are coming from. My name is Eric Termuende, and just like Taruna, I'm from Vancouver, British Columbia, and I couldn't be more excited to be a part of this panel, moderating and hosting my two incredible guests. I found that in my experience, I have stumbled through biographies before, I've mispronounced names, and we've talked about accolades and awards that just simply aren't as relevant as they could be. So with me today, I've got two incredible people that are going to help us better understand, perhaps imagine or reimagine what the future of work and HR are going to look like. Thank you so much to my two panelists. Ravin, let's start with you. If you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and sharing a little bit about what you're up to now and ultimately how you think you got to talking about reimagining the future of work and HR, that would be phenomenal.
Sure. Thanks, Eric, and really thrilled to do this with you and Alex. And thank you to Enrique for just an outstanding couple of days. It's unbelievable what you've pulled off. So hi, everyone. Ravin Jesuthasan. I'm based in the Willis Towers Watson's Chicago office. I am a managing director of the firm and also the author of 3 books on the future of work and with specific implications for the workforce and human capital. I have been in this space for just over 25 years and have had the privilege of leading a couple of pretty significant research studies the last several months, which we'll touch on today. The first being HR 4.0 with the World Economic Forum, Unilever, and Saudi Aramco. And the second being the future of the Chief People Officer, which was a joint project between SHRM and HRPS and Willis Towers Watson, where we went out and talked to over 500 CEOs, CHROs, and boards of directors. So looking forward to sharing some of that.
Fantastic. And Alex, can you share a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, thank you, Eric. Thank you, Ravin. Thank you, Enrique. And thanks to everybody listening in today. This has been a really exciting event, and I love that we can all do it virtually, given some of the concerns that are going on these days. So thanks to technology. My name is Alexandra Levit, Alex for short. I am a human capital researcher, and I like to self-style myself a futurist. And what I mean by that is really it's just someone who looks at trends that are percolating up through the market and trying to determine what has the biggest potential to cause disruption. And the area that I focus on is workforce. And my background really is in helping young professionals learn how to be more successful in the work world and helping HR professionals figure out how they can structure their workforces to be more effective, considering all of the evolution and change that is going on. But I actually, just as a quick fun fact, learned about the future and the world of futures way back in 1988 when my dad took me on a tour of the World Future Society in Washington, D.C. And I got my first glimpse of the future smartphone, which figure out how they can structure their workforces to be more effective considering all the evolution and change that is going on. But I actually just...
Carry on.
It was called interactive television, and it probably did something like that.
Fair enough.
It didn't work perfectly, but it was fascinating, and I became hooked. And these days, I'm like Ravin, I'm doing research on the future of work. I host a Workforce 2030 podcast, which Ravin was a guest on. I have a new book called Humanity Works, Merging Technologies and People for the Workforce of the Future, and speaking to great, intelligent, provocative, innovative audiences like this. And it's my favorite thing to do. So thanks for having me.
Fantastic. So here's the thing. We've been told from LinkedIn Live that we've got this phenomenal exercise in lip reading going on because the sound didn't work for the first few minutes. So what I'm going to ask in true entrepreneurial spirit is a third quick biography and introduction from each of you would be great, because I know a lot of people are looking for a quick recap. Let's hear it. Ravin, one more time from you. Can you tell us a little bit of what you're up to?
Sure. So I am based in Willis Towers Watson's Chicago office. I'm a managing director of the firm, and I have authored 3 books on the future of work, done numerous research studies. I also sit on the World Economic Forum Steering Committee on Work and Employment, and 2 studies that we'll talk about. The first being a study by the World Economic Forum called HR 4.0, and it's a pretty provocative look at how human capital strategies will evolve. And the second second with HRPS and SHRM called The Future of the Chief People Officer. So two pretty interesting pieces of research that Alex and I will tag team on.
Fantastic. Alex, let's go back to you for a quick recap, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure, it's Alex 2.0. My name is Alexandra Levit, Alex for short. I am a business and workplace author, speaker, consultant, and self-styled futurist. And what I mean by that is that I try to look for patterns percolating up through the market and determining what has the biggest potential to cause disruption. And my area is workforce. I've been studying the workforce since the beginning of my career, when originally I focused on young professionals. But as I've gotten older, I've extended, hopefully, my focus to everyone who's working today. And I became interested in the future way back in 1988, actually, when my dad and I went on a tour of the World Future Society in Washington, D.C. And I got my first glimpse of the future smartphone, which at the time was called interactive television and focused really on entertainment on demand. The time was pretty cool and probably didn't work too well, but I enjoyed seeing that. I became fascinated. And these days, like Ravin, I'm writing books, I'm writing articles, I'm doing research on the future of work, and I'm presenting to incredible audiences like this, where we have great dialogue. I host a podcast, Workforce 2030, and it's always fun. So thanks so much for having me, and I look forward to it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And for those who wanted the lip reading exercise, I hope that we're like 1 for 1 in what you read and what you just heard. A little bit about myself. My name is Eric Termuende. I'm out of Vancouver, British Columbia in Canada. I'm a speaker. Those are my name tags right there from the events that I've done all over the world about the future of work, attracting and retaining top talent. And as we reimagine the future of work in HR, there are not two people that I would rather speak with than Ravin and Alex. So thank you for that. If we could, and I'm just going to pause the panel for 20 seconds. If you're watching from anywhere around the world, I'm going to ask you to click that little applause button on the comments, just because, you know, Enrique, with all of these speakers, with all of these panels and all of these events, he is doing just an incredible job. We had a bit of a sound issue for a couple of minutes. We're back on, but I just want to say thanks to Enrique for giving us the opportunity, for giving you and everyone around the world an opportunity to connect with nearly 11,000 like-minded professionals, and just allowing this community to really come together from around the world. So thank you for that. And if I could, I would like to suggest that when we reimagine the future of work in HR, it's community, it's people coming together, it's crowdsourcing and sharing incredible information and really doing incredible things. So let's do that first, and let's level set. Alex, I'm going to come to you. When you look at the future of work and reimagining the future of work, you know, in a few words, without going into it too deep, what do you think of? What's most important to you, and what can we get the most out of?
I think of HR being a strategic function, Eric, and I think of it as being no longer something that is siloed as an individual business unit that doesn't impact everything else. The pursuit and retention of talent is an issue that is now all the way at the C-level and should be, and therefore how we pursue talent has to be something that's center stage, and HR has to be playing a role within business units as opposed to being a function that just comes in at different points. Recruiting and learning and development, it's integrated now into everything that we do from a business operational perspective.
Fantastic. And Ravin, your thoughts too?
Yeah, you know, I think it's a couple of things, Eric. I think it's important to start with how work is evolving, right? And much of that narrative around the future of work gets caught up in what technology is doing. It's actually a lot more complex and nuanced than that. Technology certainly is a significant game changer, and we'll touch on that in a second. But the democratization of work is an equally powerful force. So the ability for work to be pulled out and decoupled from the organization and all of the frictional cost of work being done by people in jobs within the organization, increasingly being able to be distributed around the world, done faster, quicker, cheaper, better, obviously enabled by technology. I think those two forces create some nuances that it's really important to understand. And it's one of the reasons why, to go back to Alex's point about the HR function, I specifically am really bullish about the future of HR. In the Future of the Chief People Officer report, we put forward this belief that we truly are at the golden age of our profession, if in fact we choose to capture the opportunities in front of us, if we choose to demonstrate the courage to capture those opportunities and stake out some new ground and shift from being the legacy stewards of employment to being stewards of work.
Can you, so now you've done quite a bit of research on this topic over the last little while, and for those who are listening in, perhaps live or on the recording, these will be in the resource library that comes in the next week or perhaps 2 or 3. But I'm curious to see if we can dive into that research a little bit to see what you found. And Alex, given all of your incredible experience, I'd love for you to comment too on what Ravin's research says, to sort of get your opinion. What I'm looking for here are a couple things. Number one, what is the opportunity to capitalize on based on what the research suggests? Number two, what is the action item that people can really take away? And number three, what are the things that we should be avoiding or staying away from? What I really love about a panel like this and experts like you is that we can get tangible right away. We can get into some takeaways, and regardless of the industry sector or size of the HR professional that's listening in today, my goal is that everyone can walk away with a couple of little tweaks and shifts that they can make so they can better prepare and reimagine the future of work for themselves.
Yeah. Great. So let's maybe start with, let's do 3 things. Let's start with how the context is changing, how work itself is changing. And then let's drill into each of the 2 studies we talked about in turn so we can share some of the pivot points and imperatives that emerge from that. And then I think the 3 of us can have a chat, Eric, to your point.
Sure.
So to pick up on my point about how work itself is changing, one of the things that we did with the World Economic Forum a number of years back was to ask the question of, is this phrase future of work, this is maybe 5 years ago, before it became like a really cool phrase. How is it truly something new and different, or is it just technology raising the speed quotient of work, and making it slightly more complicated? And in fact, what we saw were some pretty profound changes in work. And I'm going to apologize for the history lesson, but I think it's useful to start with where we have come from to get a sense of, how different the future really is. So if you think of how most of us work today, right, that way of working came about in the Second Industrial Revolution, disparate tasks organized into jobs into job families. Those jobs became the basis for careers. They became the basis for the pay and benefits and all of the things that we enjoy in quote unquote jobs in big companies today, became the basis for income during and income post-employment. And all of that worked really well in an era where you went to school for 12 to 18 years, you worked for 30 years, and then you retired for maybe 10 to 15. And it was predicated on an era of great stability, right? You fast forward to the third industrial revolution, and what you started to see for the first time was, because of the democratization of information, the advent of the World Wide Web.
Can I pause you real quick? Just so that we're on the same page, can you tell me a little bit about what the third industrial revolution was and what technology that brought to the forefront, just so that we can level set on what that shift actually looks like?
Sure. So the second industrial revolution was really predicated on significant advances in manufacturing and other types of technology. Third industrial revolution, or what Andrew McAfee and Eric Brynjolfsson call the first machine age, was really the advent of the information age. So our ability to use information in fundamentally different ways, our ability to, for the first time, look outside the walls of a company and understand the costs, risks, and other capabilities of having work done elsewhere. Because I actually had now transparency and clarity, which I didn't have when the organization was designed, when Henry Ford adapted the assembly line. And that was kind of a big game changer, because for the first time, we could actually see, well, if I moved this work from Chicago to Vancouver, what sort of access to talent would I have? What's the cost of the work, et cetera? And it was the start of alliances and the start of what we now know to be outsourcing. And that shift happened at a time where volatility was increasing. Those of us who've been around will remember the oil shocks of the early 1970s. And instead of building capabilities at very high fixed costs, like we did in the second industrial revolution, now we started to see the organization become the nexus for contracts with third parties. And companies could offset risk by lifting and shifting processes to different parts of the world, to different organizations, et cetera. the gains were about 30%. And then you fast forward to where we are today, and you in the fourth industrial revolution, and what you see are this confluence of multiple technologies that are converging. The biological, if you look at the advances in medicine and with wearables and ingestibles and digestibles, you know, coupled with the advances of AI and the surrounding infrastructure, cloud-based computing, the rapid proliferation and low cost of sensors, the dramatically falling cost and rising speed of graphic processing units, all of which are powering the digital revolution, or the second machine age, as Andrew and Eric would call it. And what you see are that these advances in technology, coupled with the democratization of work that I talked about, coming together and not just allowing us to move work anywhere in the world, but to actually take jobs, deconstruct them, distribute component tasks to a machine, to a gig worker, to an employee, to an outsourcer, anywhere in the world, and reconstruct that work back in the company at a fraction of the cost. Now, I mentioned a second ago that the gains from outsourcing were about 30%, cost, speed, etc. The reason my co-authors and I wrote our last two books, Lead the Work, Navigating a World Beyond Employment, and Reinventing Jobs, was that the analysis we were doing for clients about 5 or 6 years ago was showing not gains of 30%, but gains of 60 to 80%. And this rapid proliferation or exodus of work from its being traditionally bound up in the organization as a job. And our research has shown that over the last 100 years, the share of employees doing work has gone from the 100% we started with to today, it's closer to about 67%. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that, you know, that's going to accelerate, but we probably will reach a point of equilibrium at some point. So I think that's important context for then how we, you know, the forces that are shaping the implications for HR.
Alex, let's kick it over to you. What does that mean for HR? What does this distributed or remote work environment look like? What can we do to start to prepare now for what we thought was the future, but perhaps it's the now of work?
Not the future anymore. And
right.
Ravin said several years ago, this was something theoretical. And I still find in my conversations with organizational leaders that it tends to be theoretical, that we are talking about this as if it's something that is 5 to 10 years away, when in reality, technology has vastly outpaced our structural ability to cope with these changes. And in particular, I think the most burning issue facing HR with respect to Ravin's findings is talent assembly. And that's the ability to literally construct short-term teams that have the potential to come together in a variety of different work arrangements, whether they're gig workers or part-time workers or shift workers, whether they work virtually in an office, whether they're in British Columbia or they're in Chicago. We can tap talent from all different sources, grab people to do a project, give them the tools via technology to make that project happen, pay them accordingly, and then disband the team when we no longer need that specific team. Now that probably means that we are redeploying people. We have to figure out, and I know we'll talk more about strategic automation, but we need to figure out what role algorithms and AI are going to play on our teams. And this talent assembly is incredibly complicated, and it's something that HR has traditionally not been involved in. It's been a lot simpler in the sense of HR, their role, especially recruitment and onboarding, has been to bring people on full-time. You're working 40 hours a week, you're in one location, maybe you work from home 1 day a week, but you've got the same policies for everybody. And increasingly we are seeing with this democratization, a customization of individual work arrangements and careers. And this is a lot more work for HR people and requires a lot more partnership on behalf of the business units. And so this is probably the thing that I see where we are not set up in most organizations to work this way. Even though technology has facilitated it, we're simply not there yet. And I'll give you a very simple example. Ravin and I have talked about this before, how even something like a policy for, we've got a coronavirus circling the world, we need people to work from home who didn't work from home before. Do we have any kind of policy around that? Do we know what to tell people? Do we have the technology in place? And the answer to that is, in a lot of cases, no. Just because the technology exists does not mean that we have implemented it successfully or efficiently, and that everybody is on the same page about how we're going to use it. So I hope that this incident that's coming up now is kind of a warning sign for the fact that we need to have structures and operations around this democratization, because we can, as Ravin says, increase our results by up to 80, 100% if we play our cards right.
I want to dive into, Ravin, we'll come back to more of what the research says in a moment, but Alex, I'm going to keep on this for a second, because I think that we often get caught in our bubble of white collar, highly educated employment when we talk about the future of work. We talk about professional services, consultants, accountants, lawyers, etc. Given that we have literally hundreds of folks tuning in today, and I'm going to assume hundreds more that are listening, is Ravin, is the research that you're stating, and Alex, what you're commenting on regarding talent assembly, is this universal? Because what I would suggest is that the future of work, and we've heard this before, the future of work is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. Like we've heard that before. So my question then is, when we talk about this future of work, and we talk about talent assembly, when we talk about remote and flex working, how does this change depending on, let's just say, the color of your collar, or the industry that the company is in?
Yeah, I would say everything that Alex and I've just talked about applies to every single person, whatever the job is. And that's one of the things that I think is really important to acknowledge, Eric, is what the traditional rules, the traditional boundaries are collapsing really rapidly. I think Ginny Rometty coined the phrase gray collar, which is really the blending of the two. You're seeing what used to be blue collar roles be in some cases indistinguishable from white collar roles in terms of the technical content of the skills required, the types, the manner of working, the way they're working, the coordination of this aspects of the role. So everything that we've talked about applies universally. Now, different industries are in different places, and we can talk about some of that. Some of them are perhaps at the bleeding edge of some of these changes, but the universality of what we've just talked about, I think, can't be underestimated.
And Ravin, in one of your books, I forget which one it is, you talk about how to reskill or upskill people, and we could dive down into what reskilling and upskilling means, but how to take people who have been in those traditional, I guess, blue collar roles where they've been putting widgets on a factory assembly line. All of a sudden, they've got to teach the machine how to do it correctly. They've got all sorts of more complex tasks that there's a choice. We can either try to train people to do those, or we can try to replace them with other people. But it really makes sense, if we've got a loyal employee, to help them make that leap from what would be a traditionally simpler intellectual job to something that is far more strategic. And I think that's where that gray collar concept comes in, where why wouldn't we do that? That's the more cost efficient, fair, equitable way to handle it. So I think we are seeing that even in the most traditional manufacturing, for example, operations, that there are ways in which we can include people who might have been doing simpler tasks that could theoretically be completely automated but can't be because we require human oversight. And the other thing I would say is with respect to gig workers and people who work shifts, I hear all the time from retail organizations in particular, like, well, we can't really offer them flexible work, or we can't really, they use the fact that they have an hourly workforce as an excuse to not evolve. And the fact of the matter is, like we're saying, all of these concepts apply to any type of organization. So even if you've got an hourly workforce, there are ways that you can employ gig workers, that you can shift things around so that people aren't always working at night, that you can have teams that are rotating through the business, handling whether it's the front of the house, the back of the house. There are ways that you can take these concepts and run with them, even if people aren't what we deemed a traditional hourly workforce.
I'm just going to add something here that I think, we're getting a couple of questions, lots of great comments on the LinkedIn Live here, some of them about manufacturing, about healthcare, food processing, et cetera. And I think what's important to note too, and I think we get caught in this a lot, is that there is no universal best culture. There is no one way to move forward either. I think it's important to note that the best place to work, Fortune just put out in February, Fortune just put out their best companies to work for in 2020 list, the best big companies. Number one is Hilton, okay, the hotel chain. Number two is Ernst & Young. And what I would suggest is the people that work at Hilton wouldn't necessarily want to work at EY, and the people that work at EY wouldn't necessarily want to work at Hilton. So look, just because we wouldn't necessarily want to work at other companies doesn't mean they're not great places to work. And if we're looking at optimizing our place of work for the hundreds of people that are online now too, know that you don't need a ball pit and a keg at the end of the lunchroom to attract great talent. I think what we need to really double down on is understanding what works for us. If we've got remote and flex capabilities, fantastic. And if we don't, great. But there was one question about managing expectations. And I think what's happening so often is that we're promising the world to not just this next generation of talent, but people that are coming in and forgetting that, hey, we've got a job to do. And there might not be remote or flexible capabilities. We might be a 9-to-5 shop and you might have to come in on Saturday. But I think that unless we can manage these expectations and reimagine what the future of work is going to look like for our industry, for our company, and for our teams, that we're doing ourselves a bit of a disservice. Ravin, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I agree that you certainly have to be transparent and upfront, right? But that's always been the case. That's that has nothing to do with the new world of work. And I do agree that there are horses for courses. I think your example is a really good one, Eric, because I think too much of where this profession came from has been about quote unquote best practices. Mm-hmm. And this belief that we can take things that worked in one organization and rather blindly drop that into our context, our culture, etc. And I think the reality is that, and as we've seen this for decades, that has never really worked. And so I think what you're seeing, and we'll touch on this in a second, and specifically with the future of the Chief People Officer, these points about nuance, these points about greater insight into the talent we have today and the talent who we think was going to come join us, and then shaping a proposition that makes sense, ensuring that we're building that we are creating the capacity for HR to perpetually reinvent the work and allow people to engage with us on their terms in a way that works for our business model, I think is going to be increasingly critical. And I think Alex touched on this as well. And which I think it's, it sounds trivial and trite, but it actually isn't. This is a pretty big shift for many of legacy HR organizations who have operated with this idea of best practices to actually now having the nuances and the insights of their own business drive how they orchestrate the work and the talent that performs that work.
Mm-hmm. Great points. And I know we love to talk about just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something. And this, what Ravin's saying around culture. And the fact of the matter is, I mentioned it a minute ago, that anytime you put a machine into a process that is traditionally human driven, you need a human there to build it, to decide how to deploy it, to fix it when it's broken, and then to move on and do something completely new, to innovate. And that's a lot of people that need to be involved in processes that might, on the surface, appear to be something that you can just automate away. We're just going to get rid of these people and automate them because that's a technical best practice. So I think not only do we have to be a little leery of traditional best practices and how we govern HR, but new best practices around how we use technology is just one thing I'd like to underscore.
Yeah. Ravin, let's kick it back to you. I know you've got a lot of research. Do you mind sharing a little bit more of that with us, and we'll get Alex's comments on that?
Yeah, so we'll touch on both of those studies, and as you mentioned, Eric, everyone will have access to both of these pieces of research when Enrique sends them out next week. So the first is HR 4.0, and this was a study that was done by the World Economic Forum in partnership with Unilever, Saudi Aramco, and Willis Towers Watson. And what we did was it was based on a long-running series of data that the World Economic Forum has done with its Future of Jobs report, with the Reskilling Revolution work. And we arrived at 6 critical imperatives for the management and human capital going forward. And I want to just go through those pretty quickly. The first imperative was around developing new leadership capabilities for the fourth industrial revolution. And the thing that we know is, and this is just a personal anecdote, having been in the consulting business for almost 30 years now, I spent so much of the early part of my career helping clients decide, are we a centralized business versus a decentralized business? And about 4 or 5 years ago, those conversations started to evaporate. The reason they did was more and more business leaders started to realize that's a false choice. Every enterprise today is a distributed one. We are the hub and or the spoke of a digital ecosystem. And a critical leadership competency is increasingly our ability to orchestrate the organization or the enterprise from the edges, not from the core. And the ability to have leaders at the front lines who are shaping customer experiences, innovating, resetting cost structure, engaging talent, actually having them drive that change from the edges, I think is essential. So leadership, some new leadership capabilities being the first. The second was, how do we integrate technology into the workplace? Alex touched on this. One of the things that really kind of sticks in my craw when I see organizations lead is when they lead with technology. Every time you lead with technology, you end up in this binary situation of man or woman or machine. And the reality, as we've seen, is in fact, it's much more nuanced. There are 3 outcomes that are possible when you lead with the work instead of technology. One is you can use technology to substitute certain highly repetitive rules-based work. More often than not, as Alex touched on, it actually augments the skills of the human being. But equally, it also creates demand for new human skills. We see that in this explosion of demand for data scientists. Well, why has that come about? Because we have AI and because we have machine learning and other algorithms that we're using to increasingly power our organizations. That's new demand that's being created. The third dimension, which I think will resonate with everyone since it's the hottest term in HR for the last year or so, is enhancing the employee experience. All of the things that we just touched on a second ago. The fourth is, and this I think is a really critical one, is how do we build an agile and personalized learning culture? Learning, the L&D folks will probably be cheering for this one. It is so heartening to see learning shift from being at the periphery of the deal to increasingly being the centerpiece of the deal. The recognition that we need to reskill, upskill, outskill on a consistent basis and in a way that's aligned with the business plan. Not something that HR does in years of plenty when budgets are plentiful, but something that is a systemic part of how we run our business. And then the fifth imperative, I think the metrics geeks like myself will like this one, is how do we establish some new metrics around human capital beyond just the financial, beyond the traditional of turnover and fill rates to measures of the total cost of work so that you have a level playing field to look at the cost of employees, gig workers, the capitalized cost of machines, and actually have metrics like the return on work. And then lastly, I think almost foundational, is how do we embed diversity and inclusion into our cultures? We see consistently that cultures of inclusion systematically and systemically outperform those that are more insular. And it really needs to be a foundation for kind of the new world of work. So those were the 6 imperatives that came out of that study, and lots of great case studies of them in action.
Fantastic. Well, first of all, thank you. And for those who are on the live chat right now, know that Kay has been adding a couple of the links to the actual reports. So good to know that if you do want access to that right now, just look through the comments and you can take a look at those reports. Thank you for that, Ravin. Alex, I'm going to turn it over to you. Now, there is obviously a lot that we can speak on. So
much meat in there.
I'm going to get specific with the first question. How can leaders encourage workforce populations to develop this sense of agility? The first point that Ravin was talking about.
Well, I think the first thing they can do is lead from the front on this. Many leaders, especially those that have been raised in a more traditional manner of leader, are used to the command and control format and don't really have their arms around what is called in some circles the transformational model, where you are seeking different perspectives, you are ready to change your approach given real-time business realities. They're still operating on a 5 to 10 year business strategy structure that, as we've been talking about, doesn't really work so well anymore because we are evolving more quickly than that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think being a transformational leader yourself, where you are willing to change strategy, even if it seems risky, even if it seems difficult, I think that is a way to encourage your people. And I think also you need to encourage people to take risks themselves with their own careers, with their own projects. Agility is something that in most situations can be learned. It is something that comes more naturally to some people, but by putting parameters in place to help people develop this, such as innovation projects where people can take experimental approaches to doing a business process in a new way, to figuring out how to maximize the potential of humans and machines on a team. People who are involved and on the front lines of a particular job or function often have the greatest amount of information about how to improve that function. And so by allowing people to do that and making them feel like it's okay to fail, then you are encouraging agility. I think where rigidity comes is where people are afraid. They're afraid that they're going to do something that's going to mess up their career or mess up the business. And they need to see that part of moving forward in this new world of work is being willing to take those leaps on a fairly regular basis. It used to be something that it was unusual to take a big risk or to change direction or to pivot radically. And now that's something that needs to happen more or less on a continuous basis. And leaders can do that from the front, and they can put systems in place to allow people to do that in their jobs. And also encouraging middle managers and evaluating their performance based on how well their people can do this, I think is another strategy to take.
There's something about this agility question and this idea of failing forward, taking risks, and a lot of the folks on the LinkedIn Live are supportive of that. Oscar asked or stated something that I thought was kind of funny. He said, this might be rude, but shouldn't leaders think that learning and development should be at the center of all of their businesses anyways? So, look, risk is risky. Obviously, taking these leaps of faith, being agile, failing forward is a lot easier said than done. What can the future of HR look like, and how can we encourage more people to continue to learn, to develop? And the follow-up on that is, if we're looking at these remote teams or looking at gig employers or employees rather, how do we get people more into this new world of work, into taking risks and into trying new things?
Well, I think that the point around learning is a really good one. And it speaks to a larger issue, in my opinion, which is that shouldn't leaders be doing a lot of things that they might not be doing? I regularly go into organizations. I'm surprised by the things that I would think are obvious to be happening that aren't necessarily happening. Because everyday business realities and priorities get in the way of things like learning. And so learning does still tend to be relegated to a specific training course for a specific purpose, in person more often than not, or if it's online, it's very limited. And what we need encouraging people to do, and leaders can also govern from the front on this one, is curating learning from a variety of different sources and offering people different ways to consume a flow of information that is constantly changing. And by curating, you don't necessarily have to create new things that sometimes are very expensive if you're doing a training course from scratch, for example. But curating this content by making it available to people, by giving them the option to choose, and by encouraging people to go out and find their own content that is relevant to their roles and to use it in the way that they think is most appropriate, by empowering them and rewarding them for taking that proactive approach to learning and development, I think is something that we really have to see a shift. Right now, it's much more, and I did some research with DeVry University last year on learning and development specifically, and the fact that many organizations are dispirited by the fact that they have to tell employees what learning they need to do. They have to be very, very prescriptive about it. And they would much rather employees take responsibility for their own professional development. And so what we, I think, need to do better is communicate this to our workforce. Hey guys, you need to take responsibility for this, because that's not the way we've traditionally done it. But I do see a huge gap, and I'm glad that question was asked, because yes, it should be happening this way. But I think in a majority of situations, it still isn't. And that requires increased communication, and it requires a new way of doing things. And recognizing that learning is something that has to happen all the time, has to be continuous, has to be focused on reskilling and
Uh-oh, Ravin, are you still with me?
I'm still here, Eric.
Okay, it looks like we might have just lost Alex for a second, conveniently
or
at the
the
end of
future
her
of this
thought.
activity.
Oh, there she is. Okay. Thank you for that.
Which part did you miss?
Just the last bit of the last sentence. So we did get the lion's share of it, that's for sure.
Okay, I said business continuity. That was my last.
Okay, thank you. What I like is the questions that I were going to ask are actually quite aligned with what some of the folks on the live are asking too. So I'm going to switch to a question that we've got from the live, and I'm going to ask Ravin, this question's for you. Whose responsibility is it really for this learning and development? Is it the employee or the employer?
I think it's certainly both, but it's also not limited to the private sector. The organizations need, and we're seeing a lot more action on this front. I'll share a couple of examples in a second, but organizations really need to be much more collaborative in shaping curriculum with community colleges, high schools, and we also need to see government play the sort of role that it plays, a personal point of view. Maybe not to the extreme, but certainly what we're seeing in Denmark, Sweden, Singapore, etc., where there is in fact space to learn. You know, Eric, I want to come back to something Alex said, because I think there are three really big impediments that I consistently see to addressing that first question, right? So yes, it absolutely should be on leadership priorities to focus on learning. But you only see limited organizations doing it really well. And probably the poster child for this is Microsoft, right? With Satya Nadella coming in and talking about changing their culture from a culture of know-it-alls to a culture of learn-it-alls. And if you peel that back, what you see is some incredibly different enabling capabilities and values, right? Humility, the willingness to share, the willingness to sort of actually create space. And this is a really important point, create space for people to learn, because in most organizations, leaders don't give people the space to learn. So there are.
Can I ask you how to give more space? Because I think that's incredibly valuable and would be a great takeaway for folks to leave with.
Yeah, I think it goes back actually to something Alex said. You know, if you're giving people the space to experiment and learn and fail, you're giving them the space to learn. I think Mandela said it beautifully, right? I either win or I learn. I don't lose. And that's the mindset, I think, that underpins this culture of continuous learning. Is it's not about failure. We have to wipe that word in many respects from our vocabulary. It's about how do I keep learning from every single experience? We all know that in our personal lives. For some reason, that has not translated into corporate learning. That failure is really about learning. And I think it's also about sharing that learning and recognizing it and celebrating it and capitalizing on it so that we can learn collectively from the failures of one person. I think the other key issue is that space, that failure, based on legacy metrics, going back to that measurement imperative, is costly, right? You have in many organizations leaders who take a binary view of, you know, I could take the risk of letting people learn and potentially get good at the job, or I could do the sure thing, and the air quotes are deliberate, of hiring someone from the outside who's done this before. But I'll go back to something Alex said at the beginning. What are all the risks of hiring that person from the outside? She might have the technical skills, but what about the network within the organization? What about the cultural fit? All of those things that really determine long-term success and traction within organizations. And I think the transparency is often missing. The third part, I think, is a really important thing. And Alex, when I did your podcast, we talked about this. I have done a lot of work with organizations, you know, reinventing their work. And we focus on reskilling and upskilling and outskilling, and we should come back and define those terms in a second. But the thing that we need to also ensure is not lost is will. We take it for granted that people want to upskill and reskill, and that's not true. I've seen this on oil rigs. I've seen this in investment banks, and I've heard this from the employees of some of my clients. It's great. You've reinvented my work. You've taken away the mundane on the oil rigs. You've taken away the dull, dirty, and dangerous. Not to be too cute about it, but there's a reason why I'm on this rig, or there's a reason why I've done this one job for 20 years. I hated school. And now you're telling me I've got to go get these new skills and retool in the hopes of getting a better job, or in the hopes of staying relevant. That's a massive ask, Eric. And I think it goes back to something we started off with, which is this is a cultural change in many respects, particularly in the Western democracies. We're asking for the reversal of kind of 150 years of standard accepted ways of living. I don't want to overplay it, but I think it's, I see that playing out in the conversations I have with clients and the conversations I have with working Americans all around this country, that it's a major pivot. And so I wouldn't underestimate the cultural forces that get in the way of organizations wanting to do the right thing.
Thank you for that. Alex, I'm going to come to you.
Just say one thing about.
Please do, yeah.
Ravin and I have talked about this before, but we love this topic. But I think that those points are extraordinarily important. In fact, I would go so far as to say that when people ask me what keeps me up at night about the future of work, the traditional notion is that what should keep us up is that we're all going to be replaced by machines and we won't have anything to do. There won't be jobs. We'll all be sitting around like that movie WALL-E. My concern is not that exactly. My concern is exactly what Ravin said, that some people, either they cannot or they will not get with the new program, and they will be displaced because there will be no other choice, because it simply will be easier to automate those dull, dirty, and dangerous jobs. And so those are the people that I'm worried about. And so we could get into a whole discussion, and probably won't, on universal basic income and how that's essentially one solution, but we are going to have to look at this, because there's going to be a segment of the population that is not equipped to deal with this change. And it's something that you can't, as Ravin says, necessarily force on people. So I just wanted to bring that up as something that I think is a legitimate.
Yeah, and so with that being said, Tamara asked an interesting question that kind of follows this train of thought. How do you curate this learning content, or how do you ultimately find out what's best for your organization and your people? Because this resistance is going to live in some places and it's not in others. How do we best move forward?
Yeah, I'll give you a couple of examples, Erica and Tamara, of what I've seen work well in some organizations. So I've got a very large insurance client where they've actually said to all of their talent, we're going to equip you, we're going to educate you on how automation is coming into our industry, our business, the role of RPA, the role of AI, etc. And what we want you to do is we want to put you in a place to actually look at all the tasks you perform and tell us, where are there opportunities for automation to either substitute or augment or perhaps even create new work for you? And in exchange for that, we're going to make it safe. We're going to give you a safe space to do that. We're going to give you an incentive for doing that. We're going to give you the opportunity to upskill, to take on the new work that's been created. And we're also going to give you the opportunity to get reskilled for, if you say that, 70% of my role can actually be done by this particular algorithm or this particular type of machine learning. We will give you a safe space so that you can move into a role that you're interested in. But it's predicated on visibility and transparency to all of the work in the organization. People having the tools to be able to sort of knowledgeably deconstruct their jobs and look at how automation comes in. The other example that I'll share with you, and this is actually in the report, so now that people have the link, they can look at it, but it's what Unilever has done with its framework for the future of work that I was privileged enough to work with them on. And they are probably as progressive as any organization in thinking about the impact of automation. And so what you'll see in that report is how that framework plays out, starting with the individual at the center. not automation, not these macro forces, but what do you want? What is your purpose within the organization? And then how does that purpose align with this evolving nature of work? And where does it make sense for you to be upskilled? Where does it make sense for you to be reskilled? Or where does it make sense for you to be outskilled?
Let me ask a quick question. Maybe Alex, I'll ask you a question that perhaps I would have asked Ravin. But how many employees are really looking at their roles and suggesting that X% of it can be automated? I mean, that seems like I'm looking for a way to get myself out of work or into some forced learning. What does that look like from your perspective, Alex, around finding opportunities for next, whatever that might look like?
Well, again, I think there's a gap between what probably should be happening and what is happening. I mean, what Ravin and I always talk to employees about is the necessity of looking down a few years and saying, where is my career going? Where is my function going? What technology is available and out there? And in my world, I call these applied technology skills, understanding how business processes, people, data, and devices can be used together to drive a more efficient outcome. While we recommend that people get these and that they actively work toward making their job more efficient through the use of technology, I think people are scared. They think of it very simply that they don't want technology to take over their jobs and they don't want to lose their jobs. And so I think I would have to say, on the whole, it's not happening as rapidly as I would hope. I think there are pockets. There are what we call citizen scientists, where there are people who are within the organization, not in IT, who are figuring out ways to use technology to do their jobs better and applications. They're applying principles of data science. They're doing these things in a smart way. And as a result, I think they're adding to their own value when they, but this I still see, and I don't know what Ravin thinks, I still think this is these people are in the minority. Majority of people are doing things the way they've always done them and are going to be caught kind of unaware or unprepared. And that's why we do the work that we do. So hopefully people will be encouraged from the outside when they are curating or crowdsourcing resources for learning, encouraging people to take these actions, and also from the leaders themselves that are listening to today's session, that we really need to be educating people on what they need to do specifically in their individual job function.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, I promised Enrique that we would be done at 22 at the top of the hour, which means we've got 7 minutes left. And what I would like to do is throw a bit of a curveball. Given that the topic of today is reimagining the future of work in HR, what I would like each of you to do in 60 seconds is to paint a picture of what HR is going to look like in 2030. Alex, let's start with you.
HR in 2030 is going to be wholly integrated into the business as a whole. Talent management will have taken center stage. We will see a variety of different teams operating with the focus on the individual employee experience. So there will be no such thing as one size fits all or one career path fits all. And we will be responsible for leveraging technology to manage what will be a very complex web of individual career paths, learning mechanisms. We'll be able to track it all and figure out who we should move where in the organization in order to help the organization achieve its larger goals. Vastly different from what HR does today, vastly less siloed, and vastly more integrated.
Ravin, before I go to you to ask you your thoughts, I would like to spend one more minute with you, Alex, and ask you, what are the steps that I can do today as an HR professional to get me closer to your anticipated future?
Well, the one thing that I think is low-hanging fruit for every organization is map the skills that are currently in your organization and try to assess where you need to go. And this is going to differ by industry, it's going to differ by organization, and you're going to have to figure out, what is the population I currently have? In what capacity do they work? So what work structures do I have? Are those working? Can people do certain roles with a certain type of work arrangement? And what skills do they have? And is there a realistic way for us to move people into different roles based on our ability to reskill or upskill them? And that is something that I think you can go and do tomorrow. You can assess what have you got in your workforce and where do you need to be in the next 5 years, and what are some different strategies for getting there. I also always encourage organizations to start small, to start with one population. Do a pilot, if you will. And the word pilot gets a bad rap because we associate pilots with being like this long-standing thing. And I think what Ravin and I are saying is that iteration and innovation has to happen very rapidly, very quickly now. So do a pilot of one group in your organization that needs to learn a specific skill and see how fast you can get them trained, get that measured, and get them doing their jobs in a different way. And then as you see success, you can broaden your approach to other areas of the organization.
Thank you. Fantastic. And actionable. That's what I looked for most. So thank you for that. Ravin, let's kick it to you. In 1 minute, what does the future of HR? Let's reimagine the future of HR and the future of work together. What does HR look like in 2030?
So I'll go back to something I said at the beginning, right? So HR will be increasingly a steward of work as opposed to just a steward of employment. And what that means is HR is front and center in orchestrating what work looks like as automation comes into the organization. I don't think you will see automation and HR be separate. I think you'll see automation and HR increasingly be connected, because as HR becomes a steward of work, its ability to orchestrate all of the means for work, gig talent, employees, automation, will be front and center. At the heart of that will be an agile HR function where HR resources will swarm to problems. Alex touched on this. There will be less of the silos, less of the built up cost and hierarchy, and more of expert resources and more fungible other resources swarming to particular challenges and opportunities and responding in an agile way to business problems. I also think much of what HR will do will be centered on ensuring that experience, the employee experience, the talent experience is kind of the North Star for all of its actions and decisions, with, as we touched on, learning really being at the epicenter of that.
As an HR professional, like the hundreds that we have on today, that are looking for something that they can take back and implement right away, that doesn't require big budget, that doesn't require turbulent change, what can I start doing immediately to help me prepare for the future that you anticipate?
Yeah, so one of the areas where I think HR struggles to gain traction because it seems big and complex is around data science. And, this belief that we've got to go out and hire the data scientists, the technology is expensive, the data is expensive. What you'll find in your organizations is marketing, operations, IT, they've got a ton of data scientists. How do we take, if we're going to shift and pivot our decision-making capability with analytics, with more data science, how do we tap into the resources we already have in the firm? And I think one example would be to, knock on someone's door in marketing. And what you'll find with data scientists is they're really keen to take on projects outside of their domain. That's one talent pool, at the risk of stereotyping, that I found that they are acutely aware of how their skills are tied to their continued relevance in the world and their future compensation, maybe more so than any other role in organization.
That's how they ended up there.
And so what you'll find is they're quite keen to jump into a project. If you can take that, take your challenge, to bring in some of that capacity, borrow it from IT or marketing or finance, have them try and solve a problem you've been wrestling with, whether it's turnover, retention, challenges with time to fill, and have them take on some of that analysis and use that as an opportunity for you to learn, as well as helping them to solve your problem. It gives them some credibility. It gives them some creds with their supervisor. It gives them visibility across the organization, and it helps you bring some new capacity and capability into HR in a low cost, relatively low risk way of extending yourself.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. And with 40 seconds left to go, I want to say that what we heard today is that there are no necessary best practices. And this idea to be human, to be the HR professionals that we are, and to navigate the future of work with the resources that we've got and the resources that we can curate has never been more important. If we can give people time and space to be agile, to fail forward, to try new things, we're going to be able to create a more intentional future of work. And it's not that we know it all, it's that we can learn it all. And I think that when we do this collectively and as individuals, the future of work is greater than it's ever been before. And I'm incredibly optimistic. I'm sure I can share the words of my panelists as well in saying that the future of work is going to be phenomenal, as it already is today. I'd like to thank both Ravin and Alex for your time. If you want to connect with us on LinkedIn, ask any follow-up questions, read the reports, please do so. And a final thanks as we get to the top of the 40 minutes to Enrique for putting this all together, for making all of these, I think, 230 speakers come together and to give a once-in-a-lifetime opportunities, perhaps due to the incredible things that technology has been able us to do and allow us to come together. So signing off, thank you so much. And I hope
Thanks,
you have a great
Eric,
rest
and
of the
thanks,
conference.
Ravin.
Thank you all.